The job was simple, or at least that is what the listing had promised when I applied for the overnight position at the Oakhaven Outpost. It was a standard 24-hour service station, a lonely island of fluorescent light and cheap caffeine, anchored in a sea of high desert scrubland. My old police chief used to say that the graveyard shift was the only time a man could truly hear himself think, and since my retirement from the force, silence was the only currency I had left to spend. I arrived at 10 o'clock for my first shift, the air already beginning to bite with that dry, high-altitude chill. The manager, a man named Miller, whose eyes looked like they had been scrubbed raw with sandpaper, didn't offer a tour of the facility or a handbook on corporate etiquette. Instead, he handed me a heavy ring of keys and a single, laminated sheet of paper that contained the store's closing procedures. It all seemed incredibly procedural, the kind of mundane bureaucracy I had navigated for 20 years in uniform. We stood in the cramped office, the smell of stale coffee and industrial floor cleaner thick between us as he pointed to a specific line at the bottom of the page. It was written in a different font, perhaps added later by a different hand. It simply read, "Do not look at the mirrors." Miller didn't laugh when I asked if it was a joke. He didn't even blink. He just told me that if I needed to clean them, I was to use a blindfold and a steady hand, or better yet, leave the dust to settle until the morning crew arrived at 6. I watched him walk to his truck, his silhouette swallowed by the darkness, before his taillights even hit the main road. Left alone, I began the ritual of the night shift. I restocked the cigarette gantry, front-faced the rows of lukewarm soda, and mopped the linoleum until it shone like a dark lake under the buzzing overhead lights. Every few minutes, my gaze would drift toward the convex security mirrors perched in the corners of the ceiling, or the long, rectangular glass behind the restroom hallway. I felt the hair on my arms stand up, an old instinct from my days on patrol, telling me that something about the environment was fundamentally off. It was like every nerve in my body was suddenly screaming for me to get out. Yet there was nowhere to go but the desert. I focused on the hum of the refrigerators to drown out the silence. I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on a tired mind, a side effect of a life spent looking for trouble in the dark. I kept my head down, staring at the floor, repeating the manager's singular rule, like a mantra, as the clock crawled toward midnight. By 2 in the morning, the isolation of the high desert had transformed from a quiet companion into a suffocating weight. A dense, unnatural fog rolled in across the scrubland, thick enough to swallow the gas pumps and turn the world outside the plate glass windows into a featureless void. The silence that followed was absolute, lacking even the rhythmic clicking of cooling engines or the distant drone of the interstate. Then, the ground began to vibrate. A low-frequency hum that I felt in my molars before I heard it with my ears. It was a deep, resonating throb, accompanied by the sudden, sharp scent of hot copper that seemed to bleed out of the air conditioning vents. It smelled like an industrial accident or a butcher shop in the height of summer, thick and metallic. I stood behind the counter, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, as a deafening horn suddenly blared from the darkness outside. It wasn't the sound of a truck or a train, but something more primal, a tectonic groan that made the racks of potato chips rattle and the fluorescent lights flicker in a dying strobe. I reached for the phone, but the line was dead, offering nothing but a hollow, rhythmic clicking that matched the vibration in the floor. My old police training urged me to investigate, to find the source of the structural instability. But every instinct screamed that the danger wasn't physical. As I moved toward the back to check the breaker box, I passed the soda cave, its glass doors slick with condensation. In the periphery of my vision, something was wrong with the reflection. The rows of bright red cans didn't look like sugar and water. They looked like rows of raw, wet organs stacked behind the glass. I looked away instantly, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end, as the air in the store became muggy and hot, despite the midwinter freeze screaming against the exterior walls. The fog began to seep through the door seals, swirling across the linoleum like a living thing. I could hear a faint drumming in the clouds above the roof, a rhythmic pounding that made the very air feel heavy and pressurized. I kept my eyes fixed on my boots, but the mirrors in the restrooms began to vibrate in their frames, humming with a pitch that sounded like a human voice, moaning in distant, muffled pain. I was no longer alone in the station. The reality of the room was beginning to phase, and the wrongness was no longer a suggestion, but a physical presence pressing against my skin. The bells above the entrance didn't chime when the door opened. They groaned, the metal stretching as if the air itself had become viscous. A figure stumbled into the fluorescent haze, but it didn't move like a person. It moved like a poorly edited film, its frame rate stuttering against the backdrop of the swirling fog. I kept my gaze anchored to the scuffed linoleum, remembering Miller's sandpaper eyes and the laminated warning. But the sheer, biological wrongness of the newcomer's footsteps forced my pulse into my throat. They sounded heavy and wet, like someone dragging a saturated carpet through a puddle of oil. My peripheral vision, a traitorous remnant of my years on the force, caught the edge of a convex security mirror mounted above the engine oil display. In that curved, silvered surface, the customer wasn't wearing a flannel jacket. The reflection showed a torso that had been opened with surgical, straight-edge precision from the collarbone to the navel. The skin wasn't torn. It was peeled back in perfect, translucent flaps, revealing a cavity filled not with organs, but with the same dense, roiling fog that now choked the parking lot. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the sound of the creature's breathing, a wet, rattling whistle, filled the cramped space between the aisles. I could feel the temperature in the store skyrocketing, the air becoming a muggy, tropical weight that made my uniform cling to my back, despite the snow piling up against the exterior glass. When I dared to squint through my lashes, the geometry of the station had begun to fail. The aisle containing the automotive fluids no longer led to the back of the store. It stretched into an infinite perspective of flickering neon, the shelves eventually phasing through a solid brick wall that hadn't existed 10 minutes ago. A row of windshield wiper blades seemed to be growing out of the ceiling like iron vines, their rubber edges twitching in a phantom breeze. I backed away toward the counter, my hands searching for the silent alarm, but my fingers met only cold, damp stone. I looked down. A section of the counter had transitioned into a jagged outcrop of granite, and a man was half sunken into the rock, his face frozen in a scream of silent, crystalline agony. The creature, the customer, reached the counter. I could smell the hot copper now, a metallic stench so thick I could taste it on the back of my tongue. It reached out a hand to place a crumpled $5 bill on the stone, but its fingers didn't end in nails. They ended in flat, cauterized planes, as if the tips had been removed by a laser in one single fluid motion. I looked up, just for a millisecond, and saw its face in the mirror behind the tobacco shelf. It wasn't looking at me, it was looking past me, its eyes wide with a terror so profound it seemed to transcend the physical pain of its flayed chest. Behind my own reflection in that mirror, I saw her, my buddy's daughter, or what was left of her. She was suspended in the air of the reflection, her body cut cleanly in half above the hips, her entrails dangling like festive streamers, while crows pecked at the edges of her translucent flesh. She mouthed a single word, "Help." The building began to shake again, more violently than before, throwing the racks of candy to the floor. The mirrors didn't break. They began to ripple like the surface of a disturbed pond. I saw dozens of people within the glass, the tenants of the apartment buildings that had gone missing weeks prior. All of them fused into the architecture of their own reflections, moaning in a deafening, discordant unison. Some were encased in the glass like insects in amber, their limbs ending in those same impossible straight edges. The wrongness was no longer a sensation. It was a physical assault. The floor beneath my boots felt soft, like sinking into raw meat, and I realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated fear that the station was no longer on the map. It was being digested by whatever force lived behind the silver. I turned to run, but the exit door now led directly into a room that was entirely empty, except for an elk, standing perfectly still, its eyes fixed on the empty space where I was supposed to be. The tracks of the animal walked up to the threshold and simply ended, as if the rest of the world had been erased by a cosmic blade. I was trapped in a fractured reality, a witness to a slaughter that left no blood, only the hollow, echoing sound of a horn that signaled the end of everything I knew. The vibration in the floorboards intensified until the glass jars of pickled eggs on the counter shattered. But the shards didn't fall. They hovered in the muggy, pressurized air like static in a frozen frame. Then came the horn, that blaring, tectonic shriek that felt like a train engine was idling an inch from my eardrum, vibrating through my skull until my vision blurred. I knew what it meant. The building was preparing to move, to phase into that uncharted woods or basement dimension where the others had been taken. I ignored the elk and the impossible rooms, diving instead toward the main entrance, my boots sinking into the linoleum as if the floor had turned to cooling wax. The fog inside the station was now so thick I couldn't see 5 feet in front of me, a wall of white blindness that smelled of ozone and ancient, wet copper. I reached the double glass doors just as the ground shook with a violence that nearly threw me off my feet. I didn't look back, but I could hear the screaming start, not just from the creature at the counter, but a deafening unison of voices rising from the mirrors, a chorus of the lost and the phased moaning in a collective, rhythmic agony. I threw my weight against the push bar, my eyes squeezed shut to avoid the reflection in the glass. As I lunged toward the dark safety of the parking lot, the world seemed to tilt on a jagged axis. My trailing legs snagged on the door frame, the heavy metal slamming shut with a sound like a guillotine. The horn reached a final bone-shaking crescendo, and then, as suddenly as a candle being snuffed, the world fell silent again. I rolled onto the cold, asphalt ground, gasping for air that was no longer muggy but biting and sharp with winter frost. When I turned back, the Oakhaven Outpost was gone. There was nothing left but a concrete pad and the severed umbilical cords of the gas lines, hissing into the empty night. I tried to stand, but I collapsed instantly, a strange numbness spreading from my left ankle. I looked down, expecting blood, expecting the jagged mess of a crush injury. Instead, I saw a straight edge. My boot, my sock, and the lower half of my leg had been removed with a clean surgical precision that defied the physics of a slamming door. There was no pain, no cauterization, just an open, bloodless cross-section of bone and muscle that ended as abruptly as a hallway hitting a brick wall. I had escaped the shift, but the station had kept its toll, leaving me with a permanent, impossible reminder that some reflections are more real than the men they mimic. The doctors at the county hospital don't use the word amputation when they discuss my case. They use terms like congenital absence or anomalous formation, despite the fact that I have 40 years of medical records proving I once had 2 feet. They cannot explain why the wound never bled, or why the nerve endings terminate in a perfectly flat, translucent plane that feels as smooth as polished glass. I sit in the sterile white light of the recovery ward, the same muggy, heavy pressure of the station still lingering in the back of my throat, like a ghost of the desert air. My old police chief came to visit once, his face pale as he looked at the stump. He didn't ask what happened. He just told me that Oakhaven Outpost wasn't the first building to vanish, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. I realized then that the procedural nature of the search was just a facade, a way for those in power to pretend they are investigating a phenomenon they are actually only cataloging. I am writing this now as a warning, a digital dossier for whoever is unfortunate enough to find themselves at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. If you see a laminated sheet of paper with rules that defy logic, Do not assume it is a prank or the ramblings of a tired manager. The mirrors in those isolated places are not just silvered glass. They are anchors for something that exists in the straight edges of our reality. Every missing person, every apartment building that vanishes into the fog, and every tenant fused into the geometry of a wall is still there, trapped in the reflection of a world that has moved on without them. I can still hear the drumming in the clouds when the room gets too quiet, a rhythmic pounding that reminds me of the elk standing still in a room that shouldn't exist. The station didn't just take my leg, it took my belief in the permanence of the floor beneath my feet. I spend my nights now staring at the hospital walls, careful to avoid the small, square mirror above the sink. I know that if I look, I won't see a man in a hospital gown. I'll see the Oakhaven Outpost, flickering under its dying fluorescent lights, waiting for the next shift to begin. People need to know that the wrongness is spreading, and the next time that deafening horn sounds, it might not be a building that goes missing. It might be you.